All right, we are in our last week of the book of Jonah. If I could get the first picture. This is, I don't know if you can make it out or not, it's a picture of a monk. He's struggling mightily with a donkey. And he's having a really hard time. And I don't know if you sort of over-spiritualize monks and nuns and think they're really great and awesome and don't struggle. What are his fellow monks doing? They're laughing at him, okay? They love seeing their friend struggle. Maybe he's not their friend. Maybe he's kind of their monk enemy. And this painting is on the Wikipedia page for an amazing German word. And then if you don't know this word, you should know it, incorporate it into your vocabulary. It may also help you understand your life. It's helpful for me. And that word is, exactly, yes. Thank you, Gloria. I knew you would know it. And I hope I get the meaning of this word correctly, Gloria. German is Gloria's mother tongue. So, this is what Schadenfreude means. Literally, I get the definition. There we go. Harm joy. Okay, sounds pretty sinister, doesn't it? Schadenfreude is the experience of pleasure, joy, or self-satisfaction that comes from learning of or witnessing the troubles, failure, pain, suffering, or humiliation of another. Schadenfreude describes over 50% of my sports watching. I'm not so much about a team winning as I am about another team losing. Okay? And if it wasn't for Schadenfreude, I probably wouldn't watch sports at all. A lot of breakup songs are all about this. Hey, we've broken up. I'm doing amazing. I hear your life sucks. I'm so sorry. But not really. Schadenfreude. It's a word that we need to know. Jonah chapter 4 opens with this verse. But it displeased Jonah exceedingly, and he was angry. And that's a great translation. I want to give you a more literal translation. It reads literally in Hebrew, evil Jonah, evil exceedingly. Okay, that's a lot of evil, all right? He burned with anger. Scale of 1 to 10, how mad is Jonah? 11. Jonah goes up to 11. He is furious. He's so mad. Now, why was he mad? Do y'all remember from last week when Drew preached? Yes. He was there in Nineveh to watch Nineveh get humiliated. He had Schadenfreude. He wanted them to just fall and be smitten by God. He was there for the smiting. Nothing would have made Jonah happier than to watch Nineveh suffer. But Nineveh repented. God had mercy on them. And they were not a good people. They were a brutal empire. But God extended grace and forgiveness to them. And now this great city was now flourishing under God's grace. And Jonah now is absolutely raging because of that. He is burning with anger. He is so mad that he would rather die than spend one more minute seeing Nineveh experience the grace of God. He's that mad. What Jonah is running into is the scandal of the liberality of God's grace. That is that God not only loves you, not only loves me, but he also loves our enemies, the people who have done wrong to us, people who have wounded us. No doubt, Jonah probably knew people that were killed by the Assyrians. And yet here God is extending grace to the wrong people. This is what happens when God freely and fully forgives the people or the peoples that we deeply despise. And Jonah here is, we've said this before, he's the anti-hero in this story. He's the person you don't want to be. And I would say this, the Assyrians were wicked, but I would say that Jonah is even more wicked. He's significantly more despicable than the Ninevites, a people from this wicked and brutal empire. So that's true, and I also believe this. There are two miracles of grace in the story of Jonah. The first is that God extends forgiveness and grace to Nineveh, the capital city of the enemy of the people of God. And the second miracle of grace, I believe, is even more surprising. God's continuing mercy that he extends towards Jonah. Jonah is the greater sinner in this story. But God still engages him and extends olive branch after olive branch towards Jonah, in spite of Jonah's persistent and unwavering hardness of heart. Now, remember, if you've been following the story, this is not the first time that Jonah has opposed God's mercy. He has been fighting God's grace consistently. So this is the fifth, sixth, maybe seventh time that Jonah has said, "No, God, I don't want you to extend grace to the Ninevites." And notice in verse 4 how God responds to Jonah. You'd think at some point God is just like, enough is enough, dude. We're done here. Move on. God doesn't strike Jonah down. There's no smiting going on. God doesn't smite the Ninevites, and he doesn't smite Jonah, his reluctant prophet. Instead, I love what God does. God sort of enters into good friend or even therapist mode with curiosity. Do you do well to be angry? It's like, Jonah, I see you're emotionally invested in this. You have, use the parental phrase, you have big feelings about what has just gone down. You're deeply angry. It's an evil exceedingly to you, and you're burning with anger. I see that. Can we talk about that? Is that a good thing that you're this mad? This is textbook technique here by God. I see you, and I see that you're mad. Let's engage over that. A genuine bid for connection in the midst of a conflict. Amazing. So how does Jonah respond? He's like, I am out of here. He doesn't even say that. He just walks out the door. None of y'all have ever ended a fight like that, have you? No, of course not. I never have either. Jonah is the only person I've ever known who's been so mad that he's like, I can't even answer that question. I'm going to leave. So he just takes off. But what does he do? He gets his REI camp chair, opens it up, sets it up, small hill overlooking the town, and there he is, just hate watching the whole thing. He's like, come on, Lord of hosts. Lightning from heaven. Bring it down. He's still hoping for the worst. He hasn't changed. He cannot wait to see Nineveh burn. And still, God doesn't abandon Jonah. Causes a plant to grow up next to Jonah, and the plant gives Jonah shade. The plant makes Jonah happy. There are some people that say, oh, this is talking about weed. I'm like, I'm not so sure about that. The point here is this thing had a lot of shade to give him. And so, for the first time in this whole painful story, Jonah is happy. He's a miserable, angry dude. And for once, he's filled with joy. He's like, yes. So God sees the smile on Jonah's face, and then God sends a worm. The worm eats the stalk of the plant, and the plant dies. Then God sends a scorching wind to Jonah. And Jonah, once again, he's the angry guy from Inside Out, just mad again. But notice the brilliance of God, the brilliance and the love of God. He pivots with Jonah. Verse 9, God said to Jonah, "Do you do well to be angry for the plant?" So instead of engaging Jonah directly about his hatred of the Ninevites and his hatred of the mercy of God, that would be a front door approach. God has tried that approach several times. Front door approach doesn't seem to work with Jonah. So God is like, maybe I'll go in the side door. He finds this corner of Jonah's heart where he has joy, where he cares about something or someone other than himself, this plant. Now, granted, Jonah only cared about the plant because it gave him relief, but God, as a friend of mine tells me often, God is a God who says, I can work with that. This is not what I'd hoped for, but I think I can work with that. So God seeks to engage him on this. God sees a small space in Jonah's heart that's open, and he moves towards it and engages him there. God says to Jonah, you had compassion on this plant, pity. In other words, he wanted the plant to live. He wanted the plant to be spared. That's what compassion and pity is. And God says, because you knew that this plant brought blessing into the world. It brought good things. Things that made you happy. Things that relieved your suffering. God is legitimizing Jonah's thinking about the plant. And the form of logic that God is using here is called the argument from the lesser to the greater. Now, what does that mean? The lesser, you take something small that's true and you say, okay, this example is true, then if that's true, then let's apply that same thinking on a bigger level. So the lesser is the plant. God is saying, Jonah, what did you see in the plant? You saw potential for goodness. And you're not wrong. There was a lot of potential for goodness in that plant. And you were rightly sad to see that plant go. But it's just one plant. And you had nothing to do with its existence. It was not here yesterday. It just sprung up overnight. You only knew it for one day. Then God moves on to the greater. Okay, if that's true, how much more so should I, God, the creator of all things and all people, who created the Assyrians, who has walked with them for the entire length of their civilization, how much more so should I have pity on Nineveh? To see its people as misguided as they may be. God says, God agrees with Jonah. They don't know their left hand from their right. They're morally and spiritually clueless. You're absolutely right in the conclusions you have drawn about them. But I look at them and I don't just see their sin. I see their potential blessings and gifts that they could bring into the world. One of the recurring phrases in the book of Jonah is that great city. God did not view Nineveh through the lens of its sin. He viewed it through the lens of the potential they have as his image bearers. And therefore, he was moved to extend forgiveness and healing to them. Jonah looked at the Ninevites and he only saw sin, so he only wanted them to be destroyed. God looked at the Ninevites and saw the potential blessings that they could bring, so he wanted them to be saved. Now, I want to conclude with pondering on the conclusion of the book of Jonah. Jonah concludes on a cliffhanger. You know, it's like, okay, is there a second season of Jonah that's did it not get renewed? What seems to be the issue here? God is continuing to extend his love to Jonah, even while Jonah rejecting it. Will Jonah ever surrender to the love of God? That's a question. We don't know how this ended. There's a short story by Wendell Berry, the writer, poet, theologian, and it's a story. It's called Pray Without Ceasing, and it's a story of this man, Thad, who was not a nice man, who killed his best friend one night. He got drunk and killed his best friend in an argument. Got arrested, went to jail, and he is just absolutely and utterly miserable. And his daughter, Martha Elizabeth, comes to meet with him, Thad, while he's in jail. And this is what Wendell Berry says about this, and I think this is absolutely brilliant. People sometimes talk of God's love as if it's a pleasant thing, but it is terrible in a way. Think of all that God's love includes. It included Thad Coulter, drunk and mean and foolish, before he killed Mr. Feltner, and it included him afterwards. So then he's explaining this tender moment between Thad and his daughter. He said, that's what Thad saw. He saw his guilt. He had killed his friend. He had done what he couldn't undo. He had destroyed what he couldn't make. But in the same moment, he saw his guilt included in love that stood as near to him as Martha Elizabeth, and at that moment wore her flesh. It was surely weak and wrong of him to kill himself, to sit in judgment that way over himself. He later took his life. But surely God's love includes people who cannot bear it. That's the space that Jonah was living in. He was an evil man, yet he was still surrounded by the love of God. And I think this ambiguous, open-ended ending is a huge challenge to us. The book of Jonah is a challenge to the Jonahs of the world, the non-religious, the people who are barbaric and so forth. And God is saying, yeah, you know what? I love them too. They are within the circle of my love. But it's also a book for the Ninevites of the world, those new to the faith. Because what Jonah represents, and Drew brought this out last week really brilliantly, Jonah is a proto-Pharisee. He is somebody who takes the name of God on his lips, and then he lives entirely contrary to that, all while walking under the banner of Yahweh. And in the Bible, that's the worst kind of evil. But the book of Jonah says, guess what, Ninevites? My love still extends to the Jonahs of the world. It is a huge challenge to us. And so we can't shake that. We can't walk away from that. Annie Lamott once said famously, it's a good indicator that we've created God in our own image when he hates the same people that we hate. And we cannot do that. And Jonah comes to us. It gets packaged as a children's story. It's not a children's story. It's a grown-up story. It's like, what are you going to do with your enemies? What are you going to do with God when God says to you and God says to me, hey, guess what? I love my enemies. I love your enemies. And I'll conclude with this. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus said, love your enemies so that what? We would be children of our Father in heaven. We are to love our enemies because our Father in heaven does. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.